Thank you, Julian. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Jemina Napier, and I decided to start my presentation tonight in my first language, my mother tongue, British Sign Language. And my parents are both here tonight. Thanks to both of them for coming. And also my mother and father-in-law are also here. They're also both deaf sign language users, so thanks to them for being here. My daughter is in the front row, Tilda. She's hearing, but she is fluent in sign language as well. And I have to say hello to my husband as well, Andy. Unfortunately, he's laid up in bed. He's hurt his back at the moment, so he can't be here tonight. He can't walk, he can't move, so I hope he's watching online on the live stream. You'll see there the hashtag is signposting, all one word. So if you do want to tweet about tonight's event or send that out on social media, that would be the hashtag you would use. Now, if you do want to use the online Wi-Fi here, it's KeySurf that you would need to use. EduRoam is actually for students of the university, so guests can log into the Wi-Fi that's titled KeySurf. Now I'd like to start off just kind of going through some of the common misperceptions about what people think sign language is. A lot of people are very surprised to realise that there isn't one universal sign language. And people often comment, oh, well, why isn't there? There should be. That would be easier. It would be much easier for deaf people if we had one sign language all over the world. And my response is usually, okay, well, in spoken languages, we have lots of different spoken languages. What about here tonight? We have Spanish. Spanish in the room, please raise your hand. French speakers. Here we have some French. German speakers, I believe. We have some Germans in. Any other? Do we have Italian? Irish. We have Irish. So what if we said, oh, we should just have one language for all over the world? It would be much easier for everyone. Which one do we pick? And it's the same idea for sign language. People often assume that sign language matches exactly English and that it's just English on the hands. And it's not. Sign language has its own distinct grammar, its own structure, its own vocabulary, and part of my job is to work between those two languages. As an interpreter, I work between those two languages and two different cultures. So it's the same between a spoken language to a sign language or a spoken language to a spoken language. The same interpreting issues arise. And when we're considering the world, you know, nowadays we're becoming much more of a multilingual and a global community. So multilingualism is a very important part of that globalisation of society nowadays. And that includes that wide diversity of spoken and signed languages. So if you're talking about multilingualism, sign languages would absolutely be part of that discussion. Now, when we consider intercultural communication, that's a perspective when we consider two people who come together to engage in conversation. They may even have the same language, but they may not share a culture. If you have a British person and an American person, they may both speak English, but there can still be clashes of culture and cultural communication breakdowns because of those different cultural backgrounds. So when you have different cultures as well as different languages, then you're mediating between these two mediums. And my interest is in that area of intercultural communication where these two things come together. And obviously within that communication paradigm, interpreting studies is my field of interest. How that communication happens between those two languages and between those two cultures. So the broad theme of interpreting studies is a discipline that looks at spoken and sign language and interpreting between those two languages. In the past, we did see more of a divergence between spoken languages and sign languages, but now through research, we're realising that much of the same issues occur within both mediums. So we're able to share research between the two and see how many of these issues do in fact overlap. And my research draws on both intercultural communication and interpreting studies. So I would say I have 4 main broad research interests, as you'll see on the PowerPoint here. Sign language interpreting, applied sign linguistics as well. I'll say more about all of these areas as I go through. Interpreter pedagogy. So I'm interested in how we teach people to become interpreters. And the other area there is language brokering. And it is like interpreting a way, but there's more to it. It's not just interpreting. And again, I'll go into that in more depth as we go through the presentation. So at the moment, these are my 4 areas of research interest. Now, you've all seen the title for my presentation, and there's an image of a signpost there. So how did I get to where I am today? Professor, me, lecturing? I can't believe it. You know, I asked my mum when I was small, if you said to her then, in the future, what will Jemina become a professor? If you said professor, she'd be like, no way, get it. Jemina? No, not at all. And yet here I am. So it is possible. Anyone can become a professor. So for me, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. This was a rough drawing I did of my family tree. So as I said, I have deaf parents, but actually I come from a family with 4 generations of deaf people. So at the top, the 2 people would be my great-grandparents, who are both profoundly deaf, my grandmother and her 2 sisters, and my grandfather and his sister, then my parents. My mum has a sister who's deaf, and also I have a deaf cousin, and then down to me. Here. So it's not just that I had deaf parents, it's that I do come from that intergenerational deaf. You know, and I was the one hearing person, I was the strange one. Myself and my brother were both hearing from a very large deaf family. But everyone in my family who's hearing are able to sign. And that was normal for me growing up because we had so many deaf members in our family. And the first language of our home was BSL, British Sign Language, and English bilingually. Because obviously I went to school, I learnt French for 6 years. I then learned Spanish for 2 years. Most of that's gone, I only have a few words of my Spanish left, but I did learn that at the time. Then I moved to Australia and learned Auslan, Australian Sign Language, Auslan. And then, you know, with attending conferences and research work in America, I've also learned ASL, American Sign Language. And I've said here a smattering of other languages, like a little bit. I have the odd word. I know how to say hello, goodbye, thank you, and cheers in a few other languages. About 20 different languages, I have those basic ones. And my Chinese teacher is here, I'm sitting up there as well. I'm trying to learn a little bit of Chinese at the moment, and I'm not very good, am I? No, I'm not good at that. So as you'll see, I would consider myself multilingual. What's interesting is when I meet other people and I say, oh, I'm an interpreter, I'm bilingual, and they go, oh, how many languages do you speak? People always ask that. And I say, well, sign languages, this many. Spoken languages, English and another couple. But sign languages are my preference, that's where I'm stronger. And for me, I would really say that, you know, I have that multi-sciatic identity. Because growing up, I was hearing, I used sign language, and now I'm a mother, I'm also a daughter, I'm an interpreter, I'm a professor, and all of these different identities feed into who I am. But they all relate to whatever language I'm using, so that language use really influenced my identity and where I am now. And I would say during my life, even now that it continues within my work, I would say that I have intercultural communication embedded within my upbringing and still now in my work, within everything. And I think that's absolutely why I'm drawn to research in that area. And I'll tell you more about, you know, where I've come from and how I feel that that's brought me to where I am now. So I was thinking about what would be the best way to describe my journey. And I thought if I highlight some of my milestones, then that might help you to understand from my professional life how I've arrived at where I am. And often from how one thing was the starter for research interest in that area or other factors. So each milestone links to the research in my area. So it's a way of explaining my research, but also explaining my personal background. You see the first bullet point there on the slide is sign language interpreter. And my first paid job as a sign language interpreter was when I was 17. And my students, you should not be doing this now, you should not. But looking back at that time, I think, wow, I was 17. And I remember first going into court, I was 19. Headed in, done my interpreting, you know, I was as nervous as they were probably. And I look back now, I think, oh, 19 in court. But things were different then. We didn't have, you know, university courses for interpreters. There weren't, professionalisation of interpreters was just beginning. You know, there wasn't a lot of professional interpreters. Things were new and emerging, and I was there at the start of it, so that was new for everyone. But at the time, a lot of people said, oh, well, you're bilingual, you should be an interpreter, you can sign, you've got English, you should do that. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll go and do that. I'll go and be an interpreter. So I want to show you a few different examples of the different areas I've worked in. So from medical, TV, legal, community, mental health. I'll just show you some clips to give you some examples. It's from VHS.
Headlines. President Yeltsin has gone into a Moscow hospital to have his long-awaited heart bypass operation. Surgery began 3 hours ago. Power has been transferred to the Russian Prime Minister, Viktor Chernomyrdin.
Did you see my lovely red hair in that clip? I think I was about 22 then. So 20 years ago, and I was interpreting on TV. So another instance where I still had red hair, you'll see me there. See me with a white collar? Oh, I have a pointer. That's me there. And this was at Princess Diana's funeral. I was actually there with my husband. Andy's next to me. We were both there as sign language interpreters. He's a sign language interpreter too. Hi, Andy. And we were both there because Princess Diana at that time was actually patron of the British Deaf Association, the BDA, when she tragically died. So there were people from the British Deaf Association, deaf people, who were actually on the other side of us. 6 or 7 deaf delegates who were there. So we were invited as interpreters to interpret throughout the funeral. And you'll also see here, this is the opera singer, Pavarotti. That's him right there. And I can tell you, right through the funeral, he was in floods of tears, really emotional, wailing all through the funeral. And I'm trying to interpret with this going on in my ear. You know? It was a little bit distracting, I'd like to say. But that was definitely a demand for that interpreting, when you're interpreting in funerals and someone's crying very loudly next to you. But we were privileged to be involved and to be able to interpret in that situation. So I've been lucky that I've had the opportunity to interpret at fairly prestigious and important events for deaf people in the deaf community's lives. So this was in Australia for the Australian Prime Minister. I've got one Australian friend here, and this is for you.
As you know, people who have been to many Labor conferences in the past, it is not normal for a Prime Minister to come onto the conference floor and move a resolution. But I've chosen to do that today for the National Disability Insurance Scheme because of the importance to this for our country, because of the value we place on the Australians who have joined us today and the 2 million other Australians that they...
That looks more like me, doesn't it? That's more recognisable as me. So again, privileged to be interpreting next to the Australian Prime Minister at that time. It was related to funding for people with disabilities. So again, very important event and prestigious for the deaf community, you know. And so I had a lot of wonderful experiences thanks to my skills as an interpreter. But again, due to my bilingual upbringing, you know, that multilingualism, that multiculturalism allowed me those opportunities. And also allowed deaf people to improve within their lives by having these opportunities available and interpreted for them. What's interesting though is obviously I work as an interpreter, but when you trace things back to where that started from, why I began that kind of work. If you were to ask my mum, again, would she be becoming a professor? No chance. But if you'd looked at other examples, there is evidence there that you could have predicted potentially what I'd go to do in the future. That's me. Was I 8, Mum? Is that right? I was 8 there. And if you go through the pages, you'll see pictures of my mum, my dad, my brother. We're all signing, all these frozen pictures of sign language picture. And I feel like that book, when you look at the things I was signing, I was 8. I can't believe, when I look back. And it was prophetic, I think, when you look at, I'll show you some of the signs that I was signing. And it was prophetic in predicting what I'd be doing in the future. There's no sound on this video. So that video clip is actually my mum and I. I was 10 and it was in London. Right next to Trafalgar Square, there was a big rally at that time to recognise British Sign Language as an official language. Hundreds and thousands of deaf people there. So Mum said, okay, come on up to the front. So there was me in front of the camera, signing to my mum, signing like this, looking to the audience, and it was a huge audience in Trafalgar Square. And I think, wow, at 10 I was doing that. Again, that was like tick, there's public speaker, happy to get up on stage and present in front of lots of people, because I started at 10, so. So I was working as an interpreter. Then I began teaching, a little bit of teaching, interpreter training courses. It was in the book. Photo 8 of me signing teaching. Who knew? So I started a little bit of teaching and interpreting, but I felt that with my teaching and my interpreting, because I'd started interpreting just from my experience, I hadn't had formal training. There wasn't formal training available then. But when there was a master's degree set up at Durham University for sign language interpreting, Graham was involved at that time, Professor Turner. So I arrived as a student. Graham had just left as a student, so he didn't teach me, unfortunately. But I arrived at Durham and studied the MA in sign language interpreting. And once I'd got the MA, I understood far more about interpreting, having done that research. And that's when I really discovered linguistics and research. And that really helped me to understand what I was doing in interpreting, and really understand the complexities, the challenges, and help me realise what it was that I loved about interpreting. So really from that research made me want to find out more and look more at interpreting and linguistics. And again, from the book, Australia. And that's the old sign for Australia. People use a different sign now for Australia. Is that right, Australia? This sign. Some deaf people do this, like picked up and dumped. Like all the convicts were sent over there to Australia. So it's just Australia. It's not as vigorous as that. So that's because at that time I moved to Australia to study a PhD in linguistics. I got a Commonwealth scholarship that allowed me to go to university there and study a PhD. It should have been for 3 years to complete the PhD, to become a doctor. Again, this book, I'm telling you, there was so much there. But obviously it wasn't a medical doctor. That's the sign for a medical doctor. I was studying for a doctorate in Australia. So as I say, it should have been a 3-year stay, but I actually ended up staying there for 15 years. And hearing people, when you meet me, you'll probably not be able to work out my accent. There's a little bit of London there because I grew up in London. And then there's a little bit of Australian there. Now I'm back and I'm in Scotland, so people sometimes find that accent hard to place. Okay, I'm going to switch languages now into English.
This is Brenda. That was Yvonne, who was my voice. Now this is Brenda, who's my hands. I wanted to deliver this lecture bilingually. It was important for me to connect with all of my audience. And what I often say to people is that when I'm telling stories or talking about me, then I often feel more comfortable doing that in British Sign Language because I learned to tell stories in British Sign Language. I learned to have conversations in British Sign Language, but I learned to talk about research in English, so I often feel more comfortable talking about the research that I do in English. So going to Australia and starting my PhD triggered obviously my interest in doing research on sign language interpreting primarily in the first instance. That was what my focus was. And this book was actually published out of my PhD. It was my first major publication. And there will actually be a second edition published early next year with a slight update to some of the content. But it really did trigger for me a whole new journey, really. I didn't expect to be a professor. I didn't expect to be a researcher. I loved communication. I loved interpreting. I loved sign language. But through my experience in Australia and doing research, I realised that there was so much potential to understand more about what we do as sign language interpreters, but also about as interpreters and communicators generally by doing more research. So I've had the privilege of collaborating with other people to conduct research and to author textbooks such as this one. So this is a textbook which we actually get our students here to use and is used in many countries throughout the world, which is kind of an introductory textbook for sign language interpreting students. This is the second edition, and the third edition will be coming out next year. And when we first wrote it, we called it Sign Language Interpreting Theory and Practice in Australia and New Zealand, because we felt that a lot of the dominant texts were coming out of the United States, and we felt that we wanted something more local. But since that time, we've discovered it's used in Sweden, Finland, Germany, lots of other countries. So the next edition actually is going to have the Australia-New Zealand bit taken away from the title because it seems to be more broadly applicable. This is a book that just came out earlier this year where I collaborated with a colleague of mine, Cynthia Roy, who's one of the leading scholars in sign language interpreting research and wrote one of the sort of seminal pieces of research actually in the late 80s, early 90s. And we decided to bring together a collection of seminal texts which we felt really mapped the history of sign language interpreting as a profession, but also sign language interpreting research, and tried to pull together documents which perhaps are more difficult to get hold of these days. And we feature some articles in there which are in other languages. We actually have one of our PhD students, Lee, assisted us with translation of a French article, and another one of our students, Marwa Shami, interpreted a German article for us for this. And we're hoping that this will become a bit of a tome for interpreting students and educators to use. So when I kind of decided this is the path for me to follow, I focused my interests on sign language interpreting research and sign language interpreting as a socially situated activity. So what I mean by that is, how does it function in the real world? What happens? Who does it? Why does it happen that way? So there are projects I've been involved in, either through PhD supervision or other opportunities, that have looked more at the cognitive processes involved in interpreting. So what happens in your brain, like working memory, and what do you do when you're working between two languages? And that's kind of interesting, but I'm not really excited by what goes on in somebody's brain. I'm more excited about the impact on people and interaction in social context. And I think that's probably very much influenced by my background and the fact that I did my first degree in sociology. So I think I've always been more interested in social interactions and society rather than in psychological stuff. So my research has probably concentrated around these four main areas with respect to sign language interpreting so far. It might well touch on other areas in the future. So I'll just go through a quick kind of snapshot of the various research that I've been involved in. Like I said, collaboratively, I've done a lot of research internationally with people across different countries, and also within Australia when I was there, and obviously developing more research opportunities here. I've been here at Heriot-Watt now since February 2013. So even though this is my inaugural lecture, it's 2 years and 9 months down the track. So I've actually made quite a lot of contacts in the community and in the university and the research environment here in the UK already. So this is an example of workplace interpreting where I collaborated again. You can see this is me here, and that's Andy, my husband. And we did a case study of us interpreting for a deaf presenter. And we looked at the strategies, what strategies were being used to ensure that he could get across his message to an audience of people that could hear and couldn't sign, and what he wanted to achieve from a formal seminar presentation. And we documented the kind of collaboration between us as the interpreters and him as the presenter, which was actually sort of the first study of its kind at that time. I've also been involved in medical interpreting research. This was a study that I did with a PhD student of mine, George Major, where we had simulation of 10 doctor-patient interactions with an interpreter, or with 10 different interpreters. A real doctor, a real patient, deaf patient, and she actually came, we devised a scenario where she was based on a real case for her. She'd fractured her ankle and was looking for medication, painkillers. So we designed this role-play scenario simulation around this real case and brought in 10 different interpreters to look at the kinds of strategies that they use to facilitate that. And some of that links in with Claudia's work on medical interpreting as well, if anyone saw Claudia's inaugural lecture last year. This is the start of various legal interpreting projects I've been involved in. This one looks at how providing interpreters in court through video link or video conference actually impacts on the court proceedings. And we tested different scenarios where we had either the interpreter was remote and the deaf person was in court, or we had both the deaf person and the interpreter in remote locations being beamed in, if you like, to the courtroom. And we looked at the interpreter in court and the deaf person remote. So we looked at all these different combinations and made some recommendations to the New South Wales Department of Justice because they were looking to introduce video conferencing for interpreting into their courtrooms, and they were concerned about the potential impact, the quality of the interpreting services that would be provided. So based on our recommendations, they introduced certain conditions around when it could be used, for how long and for what kinds of cases. Another study which I'm still working on at the moment is deaf juror participation. In many countries, including the UK, deaf people can't currently serve as jurors. And so this has been an ongoing research agenda for about 10 years, originally initiated by the New South Wales Law Reform Commission. They were interested in exploring whether it would be feasible for deaf people to serve as jurors. And there have been various projects I've been involved in to kind of examine this feasibility from different perspectives. So we looked at comprehensibility. So can deaf people sufficiently comprehend legal content in order to make an informed decision as a juror? We looked at perceptions of legal professionals, lawyers, also interpreters, as to how feasible they felt it would be. And we've also been to the United States, where deaf people are permitted to serve as jurors in most states. And we've observed an empanelment process with a deaf person and a sign language interpreter. And we've spoken to judges and lawyers in the United States around their experiences of having deaf people on juries. And this is still ongoing, and I'll come back to this in a minute. This is just a cartoon that I like. Because the interesting thing is, when this project started, and I'll read it out for those, if anyone who can't see it on the live stream, it says, how many of you comprehend the term follicular? And this is someone talking to a jury, a lawyer talking to a jury, and everybody on the jury is going, what does comprehend mean? Because there was an assumption that with deaf people, can they comprehend? It's like, well, most people that aren't deaf, and are, in our case, here in the UK, English native speakers don't necessarily understand everything in a jury anyway, if they're on a jury anyway. So there's a lot of assumptions made there about access to information and being able to make informed decisions. The interesting thing is that we got to a point with our research where pretty much everyone said, yeah, we don't see that there's a barrier. Deaf people can serve. There's issues around getting qualified interpreters and making sure that the logistics are set up, but there's no reason why, except that the statutes, or for want of a better term, state that you can't have 13 people in a jury room. You can only have 12. So there have been concerns around having interpreters in the jury room, even though we could say, well, interpreters follow a code of conduct. So a professionally qualified interpreter signs up to a code of conduct, a code of ethics, retains confidentiality, impartiality, and so on. But the legal profession often struggle with that and understanding the role of the interpreter in that context. Which has led on to the current study we're working on at the moment. I went over to Australia last year and we conducted a mock trial, a 2-day mock trial, where we had, it's not a very good photo, but we had a jury of 11 hearing people, 1 deaf person, sign language interpreters. We filmed the whole trial. It was based on a real case. And then we filmed the deliberation process. So you can see here, this photo. There were the jurors all around the table. This is the deaf juror here. We have permission, by the way, to show their photos. These are the 2 interpreters who are working. So we actually had 14 people in the jury room because working conditions normally dictate that anything after 20 minutes, half an hour, you need to have 2 interpreters changing over because they get fatigued. So we filmed the whole thing, and we interviewed everybody involved, and we're still in the process of analysing the data because we have hours and hours of data. But basically what we found is that the deaf juror participated. We wanted to look at how much they could participate and if it seemed to have any impact on that process of deliberation. And our preliminary findings are showing that the deaf juror participated, the interpreters weren't involved in any way in the discussion, and all the hearing jurors that we interviewed said, it was great, it went really smoothly, we all took turns, everyone got to have their say, we don't think it's a problem. The judge said he didn't feel it was a problem. The barristers are the ones who went, yeah, still not sure, but in principle, we think it might work, but we still need to think about it a bit more. But we're getting there, you know. And I'm actually on a working group for the UK Ministry of Justice at the moment where they're looking at access for deaf people to the justice system right through from police, prisons, in court, and they're also looking at the issue of deaf jurors. So they're waiting for the results of this research, which might make an impact not just in Australia, but also here in the UK and in other countries too. This is a project I'm involved in at the moment with Graham Turner and Rob Skinner, who's our research associate, who couldn't be here today, in collaboration with other European countries. It's an EU-funded project to look at access to justice for deaf people and focuses on their access in police settings. So we've conducted interviews with a whole range of different stakeholders, and we've also managed to get hold of some data. This isn't the picture of the real data that we've got, but it's a simulation to show what it looks like, the data that we've got, which was shared with us through Police Scotland, and I'm working in collaboration with Ursula Boza to examine the interactions that occur in a interpreted police interview with a BSL user, deaf BSL user, and an interpreter. And it's really rare to get hold of this data, so we're very thankful to Ursula and to Police Scotland for giving us the opportunity to examine this data, because it will just help us learn more about what happens in that context and how we can then train interpreting students to think about working in that context in future. This is another project I've been involved in, an EU-funded project which looked at video remote interpreting to provide deaf people the opportunity to participate politically. So anybody at the moment you can make contact with your MEP, or you can contact any European institution through the telephone, by email. And this project was funded to examine whether a video remote interpreting service would be feasible to enable deaf people to contact their MEPs or other European institutions. And we were involved with a consortium of people, and basically what we found was, yes, it's all workable as long as the technologies works and the logistics all are in place. Then deaf people said they want it, interpreters said they're happy to work in that environment, and it's all feasible, but often it's, at the end of the day, it's who's going to pay for it. This is another project that I'm still working on with colleagues from Australia. We collected 11 hours of data in classrooms, high school classrooms, where there were deaf students in inclusive classrooms, so with hearing students and with interpreters. and examining, what we were particularly interested in was the question-answer sequences in the classroom, because if you look at educational research, it shows that questioning is a really important part of the learning process for students, and having question-answer interactions between teachers and students is really important. And often there's this kind of illusion of inclusion, so people think that by putting an interpreter in the classroom for a deaf student, that makes it all okay, because they've got access. And my colleague Audrey Cameron here has done some similar work here in the UK, where what we found was that the deaf students aren't getting access to the questions, and that's not at no fault of the interpreters. The interpreters are trying to keep up, they're trying to do the best they can, and what they're often doing is things like summarising question-answer interactions, so the student knows what the topic is and can keep up, but doesn't get the cues, the invitation to participate. Doesn't say, or by the time they've got the question, it's been answered, and another question's been asked, and the student's like this. And the teacher's like, yeah, someone else, Joe Bloggs over here already answered that question 5 minutes ago, because of the time delay through that process. And so we didn't want this to criticise the interpreters, but we wanted to try and have some more evidence to be able to educate teachers on strategies in the classroom. So if you have a deaf student in your classroom with interpreters, think about these things. But also to the interpreters, to get them to think, yes, okay, you can summarise, that's a really good strategy to keep up, but what else is being missed out as a result of that? So this is something we're still writing up at the moment. So you can see breadth of work that I have done on sign language interpreting. And as a result of the research that I was doing, I started teaching a little bit in university. I became more involved in doing professional development training for sign language interpreters. So I had the privilege of teaching in Fiji and in Kosovo, and I've given lectures and delivered presentations in Brazil, in America, in China, all over. And this is, for me, it's a commitment to translating my research, if you like, into practice, especially in those countries where their professions are still developing, where they're still evolving as a profession. Because here in the UK and in Australia, we often complain about the problems that we still experience as a profession, but we're so privileged, and the deaf community is so privileged compared to the experiences in many other countries. As a result of doing my PhD in Australia, one of the reasons I stayed so long was because the university I was at, Macquarie University in Sydney, they had a translation interpreting program, but they didn't have sign language in their program. So I was asked the question, why don't you have sign language? And they said, well, we've not had anyone to teach it because it's that chicken and egg thing. Yeah, so you need someone who's got a master's qualification and ideally a PhD to teach at postgraduate level, because their program was at postgraduate level. But we don't have a degree of that kind in Australia, so we don't have anyone who has those qualifications. I was like, I'll do it. I have a master's in sign language interpreting from Durham University, and now I have a PhD in linguistics. And they went, okay, set up the program. So with some support from people within the department there, I set up the first postgraduate diploma in Auslan interpreting in Australia, and it's now also a master's program, and it's still running now. And that got me interested in my next kind of line of research, if you like. So applied sign linguistics. And so interpreting could be considered within applied sign linguistics. Applied linguistics is about learning and teaching languages, but also language in use. And so this is actually a book that is coming out at the end of this year, which I've co-authored with a colleague of mine, Lorraine Leeson, who's based at Trinity College in Ireland, and she's working with us on the Justice Signs project, the police interpreting project as well. And what we've tried to do is take the concepts in applied linguistics and look at how that works in applied sign linguistics. So where is sign language used? Who is it used by? How is it used? In what contexts? How is it used by language professionals, so interpreters and translators? How is it learnt? How is it taught? And so on. So look out for that. It's coming out in a few months' time. Another sort of applied sign linguistics project I've been involved in is this medical sign bank, where I collaborated with a colleague of mine who's a linguist, sign linguist, Trevor Johnston, who he named the language Australian Sign Language. And we identified that there seemed to be a dearth of health-related signs. There was a limited vocabulary in Auslan for describing medical concepts. So we got funding to set up a sort of bottom-up language planning project where we tried to engage the deaf community and interpreters to tell us what signs they use for different medical concepts. It didn't really work that well because people were reluctant to share with us through this medium. If we went out and did focus groups and we said, tell us a sign for this, they quite happily went through a whole range of things. But if we said, okay, well, can you sign yourself signing a sign and upload it to the thing, and then we'll refilm it and make it public. We wouldn't make you public, but we'll do a sort of nice citation form. People just didn't do it. So we've actually written about what some of the pitfalls were and recommendations around language planning for sign language users as a result of this project. This is something I'm quite proud of. And you'll probably see where I'm going with some of this, with my research and the impact that it has potentially on the community and informing policy and practice. So I often talk about the 4 Ps with my PhD students, and it's something that I always keep in mind when I'm conducting research and when I'm publishing, is how does my research apply to policy, practice for interpreters, pedagogy, and also potentially in provision, so the provision of interpreting services or language services for sign language users predominantly. But I think a lot of my research is more broadly applicable than that. And so this is a study I was involved in looking at deaf people's access to healthcare information. And we interviewed 72 deaf people throughout Australia, and it actually won the best research article by the Royal Australian College of GPs in their medical journal. So I was very proud and we targeted specifically, we wanted this information to get to GPs so they wouldn't just say, oh, it's okay, we can write notes, or can you lip read me? That they realise the importance of getting interpreters and having translated information. That's another book that is coming out later this year, which looks at how deaf people communicate on an international level in different contexts and different ways. Next milestone, getting there. Oh, it's at 10 to 6 already. I should speed up. So basically, the theme from my talk is that when things happen in my life, it triggers my research interest. So because I was involved in setting up this university program, started teaching more, then I thought, well, I should study how to teach properly. So I did a master's in professional and higher education, which then led to my interest in doing pedagogy research. So I've been involved in examining how we can best teach sign language interpreters, but also translators and interpreters generally. And this is a book that came out earlier this year, which I co-edited with a colleague of mine in America, looking at how we can use technology in interpreter education. And this is more broadly as well. Becoming head of the translation and interpreting program at Macquarie meant that I was then responsible for all of the languages there, and that's what led me to coming to here to Heriot-Watt too, because I was really excited that even though my area of expertise is sign language, I was really keen to be in a department which had various languages. It wasn't about deaf stuff, it was actually about language stuff, and recognising that sign languages and spoken languages are on a par. So I've been involved in contributing to various books, encyclopedias, handbooks that are about translation and interpreting generally, and sometimes talking about sign language interpreting or comparing spoken and sign language interpreting. And I've written a book on research methods in interpreting with a spoken language interpreting research colleague, Sandra Hale, who many of you will know of, because we felt it was really important to collaborate on this kind of endeavour. So more and more my work now is I started out with sign language, and now I'm moving towards this idea that yes, sign language is still the bedrock of everything that I do, but I'm actually more interested in looking at how we can examine our interpreting practice and pedagogy and think about how we can apply that across language communication, intercultural communication, translation, interpreting generally, regardless of the languages that you use. So I'm becoming more involved in research cooperation with spoken and sign language colleagues. So up till now, a lot of my research had been with other sign language researchers, but I'm now able to cooperate with other spoken language researchers. So with Sandra Hale, we looked at witness testimony through interpretation and how jurors perceive witnesses when they give their testimony through an interpreter. And so now I'm here, and I'm head of department. Robert managed to persuade me to be the head of department after I'd only been here 18 months, which I am enjoying. And this is my final area of research, very quickly. There's Tilda. I thought it might keep her interested if I put a photo of her up there. But no, she's embarrassed. This is actually the sign for interpreter. And I took a photo of her because she's wearing black, and Brenda's probably the slightly different, but Yvonne is playing to the stereotype that sign language interpreters always seem to wear black, all black. And that's primarily because when you're signing, you don't want any distraction from patterns or too many different colours because it's hard to concentrate. So it's become a bit of a uniform. So we took this picture one day because we thought it was quite funny. She looked like an interpreter. But my interest in language brokering research came about because of seeing Tilda actually support my mother, so her grandmother, when there was something on television that Mum couldn't understand, the captions weren't working or weren't very clear. And so Tilda was telling her what was said, and Mum said to me, I didn't ask her to do that for me, and I didn't ask her to interpret, and it piqued my interest as to why she did that, because we have this professional sign language interpreting now. Often people say, you shouldn't get your kids to interpret for you don't need to because there's professionals, but kids still do it. So this is my next area of research is around language brokering and looking at, so brokering is language and cultural mediation, but not in a non-professional sense, rather than professional sign language interpreting sense. So that's the other area of research. And I was going to show you a cute video, but we're running out of time, so I won't show you that. But this is other examples of research that I've been conducting, starting in Australia and here, working with kids who have deaf parents who can hear, also talking to deaf parents and talking to adults who are interpreters who grew up with deaf parents about how they feel about their experiences growing up interpreting or brokering for their family members, and then how it's led them to their professional careers now. So the underpinning of all my research is community participation, working with the community and working with the profession, the sign language interpreting profession, and also the broader translation interpreting profession to ensure that research is relevant and interesting and has impact. To engage in the community, so I'm involved in various advisory groups and committees in deaf organisations and interpreting organisations and so on at local, sort of national, international levels to try and raise the profile of what we need as a sign language interpreting profession, but really about meeting the needs of the deaf community worldwide. And I've become quite good at knowledge transfer. I didn't know it was called knowledge transfer until quite recently, and this is a sort of a buzzword in research terms, but thinking about how do we engage the community and remove research from its ivory tower, so making sure that it's accessible. So I regularly do videos. I've got my own YouTube channel, if anyone's interested in subscribing to it. But I regularly do updates about the research that we're doing in sign language so that it's accessible to the deaf community. And we also have a really good blog, Life in Links blog. Where's Katerina? Is Katerina here? Katerina Strani is our Life in Links blog coordinator, and has done an excellent job in getting contributions from across the whole department. But we use that as an opportunity to showcase what we're doing with our research. And I always make sure that whenever I write a blog, I do a link to a summary of that in sign language as well. And there are many opportunities for us in our field to think about how we can disseminate our research in sign language rather than in its written form, which is typical of academia. So this is a journal which is published by Gallaudet University, where all the submissions are in sign language, predominantly American Sign Language, but are all in sign language. We live stream events, which is what we're doing now, and this is a community event that we did about our Justice Science project a few weeks ago, where the whole thing was delivered in sign language and was live streamed to the community. So where to from here? I should wrap up because Robert's kind of wanting to send everyone off for a glass of wine, I'm sure. There's lots and lots of opportunities for us, not just here in Scotland, but internationally. You might be aware of the BSL bill that was read in Parliament a few weeks ago and is now going to be, shortly, an act, which has massive implications for us as a university, because Heriot-Watt's the only university that has any training for sign language interpreters and any real systematic research on sign language related topics. The fact that the BSL is now recognised on a par with Gaelic as a minority community language in Scotland means that there'll be a national plan. People will be expected to promote BSL wherever possible. So there are many opportunities for us here as a university and for the community as well, more importantly. We had the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which specifically mentions sign language in 5 out of the 30 articles, and the fact that deaf people have the right to access professional sign language interpreters. So the deaf community have a tool to use to lobby. And we also have other European directives, like the Directive for the Right to Access Criminal Proceedings in Your Own Language, which is about spoken and sign language interpreting. And now sign language is, in America, it's the 4th most commonly learnt foreign language. And I believe there was a survey done recently by an organisation here in the UK, the National Deaf Children's Society, and they found that all the respondents in their study said that learning British Sign Language was the 2nd most popular language to be learned above, like French, Spanish and so on. So there are lots of opportunities for us to think about encouraging more people to learn sign language and hopefully getting them to come and study with us here at Heriot-Watt. And these are other resources that are available. And this is my quote from me. Because I was like, I want to finish with a quote. And I was like, this is a good quote because I said it. But given the slow emergence of more collaboration between spoken and sign language interpreting researchers, the future looks bright, with possibilities of increasing collaboration and replication of research across modalities. Greater interaction across the interpreting sector can potentially lead to increased collaboration in terms of service delivery, standards, training, and professional representation. Thank you.